Good afternoon. My name is Zach Langway. I'm a member of the class of 2009, and I'm Brown University's Vice President for Alumni Relations. I'd like to offer a warm welcome to students and alumni, parents, family members, and friends who are here with us today. And I'd like to extend a special welcome back to alumni from the class of 1973 who are joining us both in person and online as you continue to celebrate your 50th Brown reunion. We are thrilled to share this space and this conversation with each of you, and we're so pleased to have our friends from the class of 73 with us as we hear from one of your own notable alums in today's talk. To begin our program, it is my honor to introduce our university's president. President Paxson has served as Brown's 19th president and a professor of economics and public policy since 2012. Under her leadership, Brown has elevated teaching and research, developed the physical campus to support a world-class education, strengthened community engagement, and supported the students, faculty, and staff who live, work, and learn at Brown. As a member of Brown's administration, I feel privileged to work for her, and certainly as a Brown alum, I am deeply proud to have her as our university's leader. Please join me in welcoming President Paxson.
Thank you so much, Zach. And good afternoon, everybody. As Zach said, I am Chris Paxson. I'm president of Brown. I have the privilege of serving in this role. And it's my great pleasure to welcome all of you this afternoon to a very special family weekend forum featuring a distinguished Brown alumnus, Tom Mallon. And this is a very unique opportunity to bring generations of Brownonians together. We have parents here in the room, family members. This is family weekend. And I hope those of you who are families who are here are having a great time seeing your students. Maybe you're giving them a break right now. Some of them may be here. But, you know, you may be talking to them about their career paths, and some of them are studying history. Some of them want to be writers. And we have a great example of what that can look like as a career. At the same time, we're joined by a Brown alumnus of the class of 1973 who will be talking about decades of research and writings and considerations of Richard Nixon. And this spans from the 1960 Kennedy-Nixon election, when he was 9 years old, not Richard Nixon, our author, was 9 years old, through the years of the Nixon presidency while he was at Brown, through the writing of his novel about Watergate into the present day. And as demonstrated by the title of this forum, Me and My Shadow, Tom will be adding a personal layer to today's talk. For this event, we're really pleased to have a number of Brown's fellow classmates from the great class of 1973. They're again celebrate, yes, we can applaud for them, yes. Continuing the celebration of their 50th reunion, there are people who are here in person, people who are watching a live stream. I want to recognize your class president, Marie Stokel, and everybody else from the class of 73. Thank you. So this afternoon, I have the honor of introducing award-winning novelist and essayist Tom Mallon. He is the author of several works of fiction, including Henry and Clara, Fellow Travelers, which is currently under production into a Showtime limited series, the recently released Up with the Sun, and Watergate, a finalist for the PEN/Faulkner Award, which you'll hear more about shortly. He's also written volumes of nonfiction about topics ranging from plagiarism to the Kennedy assassination. His work appears in The New Yorker, the New York Times Book Review, and many other distinguished publications. He's been a literary editor of GQ, a deputy chair of the National Endowment for the Humanities, which has a long association with Brown University. And he's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and professor emeritus of English at the George Washington University. His honors include Guggenheim and Rockefeller Fellowships, the National Book Critics Circle Citation for Reviewing, and the Versailles Prize of the American Academy of Arts and Letters for distinguished prose style. After receiving his bachelor's degree from Brown in 1973, with so many of you here, he went on to receive his PhD in English and American Literature from Harvard. Just a little bit about how we're going to do this event. Tom will come up and speak. There will be a Q&A. Sadly, I have to leave for another event before the Q&A starts, just before the Q&A starts, but I know this is going to be a really exciting, interesting conversation. So everybody, please join me in welcoming Tom Mallon. Thank you.
Thank you, President Paxson, and good afternoon to everyone. Over the decades, I've committed a lot of words about this subject to paper, and many of those words have found their way into this talk. Nonetheless, as I hope you'll see, it has been shaped very much by the experience of the class of 1973, whose members, myself among them, celebrated our 50th reunion at Brown this past May. We also have pictures. On November 8th, 1960, I voted for Richard Nixon. The week before, I had turned 9. And according to my 4th grade report card from that September, I stood 4 feet 1 1/4 inches tall and weighed 55 pounds. Small enough to be permitted entry into the curtained voting booth in the Stewart Manor School on Long Island, where my father let me pull the lever for Nixon and his running mate, Henry Cabot Lodge. John F. Kennedy's Catholicism cut little ice with the newly prosperous Irish ex-New Dealers who lived on our suburban street. Their liking of Ike had proved to be more than a fling, and by 1960 they were beginning to feel permanently at home in the Republican Party. Affection for my wry, sweet-tempered father left me immune to much of JFK's chivalric glamour. My father always called him Kennedy instead of Kennedy, a pronunciation meant to sound oat wasp, which from my dad's point of view, this rich, educated New Englander whose father had gone to Harvard, for Christ's sake, might as well have been. Throughout the fall 1960 campaign, I wore my Nixon Lodge Experience Counts button to school, where I tried to persuade my fellow 4th graders that John F. Kennedy wasn't ready to be president. On election night, the early returns came in badly for my man, and I went upset from the living room into the kitchen, perhaps afraid to embarrass myself in front of my elder sister, who thought Kennedy was dreamy. And I had a chat with my father. I confessed to him my anxiety and disbelief. Could Nixon, so much more qualified than his opponent, really be in danger of losing? My low-key dad told me gently that it looked that way. That was the only time Mrs. Nixon ever cried in public. This was his early concession speech to Kennedy that night. In the late 1960s, the young Roger Ailes, who went on to give us Fox News, joked that the by-then perennial candidate Nixon had been, quote, 42 years old the day he was born. Other kids got footballs for Christmas. Nixon got a briefcase, and he loved it. And your point, I thought, when I first heard this line? My childhood, unshadowed by tuberculosis and early death, as Nixon's was, governed by a merry father instead of a martinet, was much happier than Richard Nixon's. But I, too, was a studious striver. Bent upon success, I was also half in love with failure and reaction. I played George III and Jefferson Davis in elementary school debates. Nixon appeared on Jack Parr's Friday night television program on March 8, 1963, 4 months after his second big defeat in the California governor's race. I was watching. After chatting with the host, the former vice president played the piano, a brief, sugary classical piece that he'd written himself. Months after telling reporters that they wouldn't have Nixon to kick around any longer, he now seemed willing to play the good sport, to accept applause tinged with pity. Had it come to that? I kept track of him over the next few years, during and after a more straightforward infatuation with Barry Goldwater, as he made his way back, campaigning for all those congressional candidates who a couple of years later would owe him their support. In scanning the contemporary scene, I came to admire Nixon the fighter, the patient comeback artist. I was not yet aware that his own thrill in getting up from the mat may have depended on the equal or greater thrill he derived from the blow that preceded it. During his 1968 race, I saw him, and I'm sure members of the class of '73 did too, appear on Laugh-In, trying once more to freshen his image and play against type, using the catchphrase of that program, "Sock it to me." On October 5th of that year, I'm pretty sure I shook his hand, Pat Nixon's too, when they came through town. Nixon stood right in front of me on the white trunk of a car on Hempstead Turnpike on Long Island. How this was allowed only months after the assassinations of Dr. King and Bobby Kennedy is beyond me, but it's true. And he gave a quick speech full of World Series metaphors that even then I realized was, at least from a rhetorical point of view, pretty awful. I also remember how Mrs. Nixon, sitting on the top of the convertible's back seat, was wearing tall, spiky heels that were digging into the seat's red leather upholstery. I was just turning 17 and totally innocent of pornography's tropes, but the image somehow suggested hidden depths to her, and it stuck with me. On November 5th, I went to bed with my transistor radio at my ear, determined to stay awake until her husband definitively edged past Hubert Humphrey. I still possess a one-sided vinyl record of Richard Nixon's 1968 convention acceptance speech, in which he talks of himself as a boy who, quote, hears the train go by at night and dreams of faraway places where he'd like to go. In the entire mendacious film oeuvre of Oliver Stone, I have seen only one moment that contains an essential, if non-factual, truth. Anthony Hopkins, playing the title role in Stone's Nixon, is talking to the White House portraits, and he says to Kennedy's, "When they look at you, they see what they want to be. When they look at me, they see what they are." Tom Wicker, one of Nixon's biographers, titled his book, "One of Us." Richard Nixon has been my exhausting life partner, the single figure by whom I have been most absorbed, and with whom, to my occasional dismay, I have most identified. To those members of the class of '73 who are here in Solomon or watching remotely, you and I went off to college 7.5 months into the Nixon presidency. I was all in favor of his policy of winding down the war via a gradual withdrawal of American troops that he called Vietnamization. In my high school valedictorian speech a few months earlier, I had praised this middle course between, quote, unacceptable extremes of surrender and slaughter. Coming to Brown, I was very aware of myself as a financial aid student whose father had never gone past the 8th grade. I wanted to work hard and do well, and was not in sympathy with the new curriculum, which I'd first heard about in the pages of the New York Times a month after being accepted to Brown. I've described myself as someone who spent the age of Aquarius looking for dry land. And in this picture, taken on September 7, 1969, as I was moving into the West Quad, complete with my brown beanie. I don't know if they still give freshmen beanies. This was moving in, September 7, 1969, and I see that I am literally keeping my head down. I remember noticing that the flags that day were at half-mast. I think I worried that students had lowered them out of respect for the just-deceased Ho Chi Minh. I later learned, to my relief, that the flags had been dipped because Everett Dirksen, the sonorous old Senate minority leader, had died that day. Throughout freshman year, I generally defended Nixon in dormitory bull sessions, tried to ignore the anti-war moratorium days, and voted against the call for a student strike during the convulsions of May 1970. 2 pictures from that month survive in my possession. Here is my freshman roommate, John Richards, with the late, wonderful Jim McBee, in Jim's room, I think, with you-know-who glowering down from an anti-war poster on the wall. But here am I, a room or 2 away, typing up a term paper on the 18th century literary grand tour, even though classes had already been canceled. Despite my business as usual affect, that man on the wall poster was making things untenable for me. I may have been against the strike, but I was not at all for this latest move in Southeast Asia. We were getting out of Vietnam by going into Cambodia, and I hated listening to Nixon drop his G's as if he were one of his own new hard hat supporters when referring 3 days before Kent State to the bums who were burning up the books and blowing up the campuses. Supporting him began to make me feel not just embattled, but freakish. I pulled back, quarreled with my father about what his man was now doing. I think I actually scrawled "return to sender," God forgive me, across one letter from home, scorning my old man the way Nixon was scorned by the student demonstrators he clumsily visited in the middle of the night at the Lincoln Memorial. I was 18 years old and frightened. Nixon was frightened too. Little more than a ring of empty buses protected the White House from the hundreds of thousands of protesters in Washington, and he took to running the government from his fortified lodge at Camp David. This, I'm convinced, was the trigger for paranoia, what led to the plumbers, the enemies list, the break-ins, not, as conventional wisdom has it, the theft and publication of the Pentagon Papers a year later. In the end, things calmed down, and partly by his doing. The troops continued to come home, albeit slowly, and the president pursued a domestic agenda that was, in many respects, a guaranteed national income, universal medical insurance, heavy increases in arts funding, more liberal than some of what Bill Clinton or Barack Obama would eventually put forward. Watch what we do, not what we say, his Attorney General John Mitchell remarked in a burst of political candor never equaled by anyone since. And of course, the president went to China. Here I am on February 28, 1972, trying to sound clever about it in my diary. Quote, "At this moment, the only thing I would say is clear is that Taiwan savings bonds are not an especially good buy." But this entry also contains my own wary peace feeler to the man I'd stepped away from 2 years before. It's offered as part of a compliment to Mrs. Nixon's progress through Peking, how she seemed lovely and warm throughout. Quote, "In one way, the Nixons are better at this sort of ice-breaking than anyone else. They always feel they're a little out of their league, are always cautious and a little unsure of themselves because of their backgrounds, defeats, etc." Unquote. Here I can detect the voice of the scholarship student, me, the self-doubter, the boy who, if he were going to China, would read every briefing book twice, as I'm sure Nixon did himself, rather than trying to get by on his small natural allotments of charm. Vietnamized or not, the war in Vietnam persisted, sometimes with frightening flare-ups. In May of '72, Nixon mined Haiphong Harbor, which brought fears of direct Soviet intervention. My diary records an evening of apocalyptic jokes at the Gate, the old Pembroke snack bar. My close friend Tom Lewis, yes, that is a can of Budweiser. Tom Lewis, a committed Marxist until his death a few years ago, quote, again, this is from my diary, called up Brown University information to ask where the nearest fallout shelter is. The confused voice at the other end suggested he call security. Still, Nixon's re-election was soon a foregone conclusion, despite the bumper crop of memorable graffiti that persisted in dormitory bathrooms, including "Don't change dicks in the middle of a screw, vote for Nixon in '72. Even after he'd won, the Christmas bombing of Hanoi was yet to come before the long American phase of the war ended with an Eliotic whimper. The peace agreement, which Nixon himself knew would never hold, was announced on January 23, 1973, one day after the death of Lyndon Johnson. I remember Karen Edwards, as dear a friend to me as Tom, asking with a perceptive sadness if I didn't think it strange that no bells were ringing, not from any university building or even a church. The president ended the draft as our class was graduating and was awarding a citation at commencement to Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward, who weren't there, but whose months of reporting had lit the fuse that made the Watergate story explode in March of our senior year. We derived entertainment during our last weeks on campus from watching the sudden barrage of developments on the evening news. After a decade of urban riots, assassination, and napalm, the hapless burglary and cover-up felt at first like guffaw-worthy comic relief. That summer, watching the evening news with my father, I heard him break ranks with Nixon for about 10 seconds. He turned to me and said, "Liddy's a weirdo, isn't he?" I responded with something like, yeah, before my dad immediately went back on message, resuming his silent salute to Nixon's sinking ship. I had begun to regard the whole scandal with a certain detachment, maybe beginning to acquire the novelistic perspective I would employ 35 years later. Back in the summer of '73, I literally altered my vision by deciding that I liked John Dean's eyeglasses. I adopted his style of frames for the next half-century. The scandal played itself out for another year until the resignation in August 1974, which turned out to be the only month of my life when I've ever been seriously sick. Some ferocious sort of food poisoning persisted in me for weeks, rendering me gaunt and dangerously dehydrated. By the time I was recovering in the hospital, the fever at last broken, Jerry Ford was in the White House toasting his own English muffins. Our long national nightmare, as he said, was over, and I regained my health, left to wonder whether my body somehow hadn't been playing empathetic host to Nixon's political death throes. I actually don't put that much stock in the psychosomatic, but there was something that attached me to Richard Nixon, not to the darkest parts of his nature, but to the man who craved burial for its opportunities of resurrection. He died on April 22, 1994. My diary for that day says, quote, "Came home to the news that Richard Nixon, a man who let me down again and again, and to whom I feel deeply connected, has died. At 9:08 p.m. at the age of 81. There was never a time in my life when he wasn't on the scene. He was already a senator when I was born. And now he's gone, and I sat before the television sobbing." That morning, according to the same diary entry, I'd suffered an ordinary little career setback, the collapse of a magazine assignment that had been presented to me as a sure thing and on which I was working very hard. My partner and I went out that night to hear some music at the Café Carlyle, about 20 blocks from where Nixon was dying. But it's not in me to take my mind off disappointment, and I remained raw, more so than I thought, throughout our hours at the nightclub. It was this wounded, I'll show him mood, they wouldn't have Mallon to kick around anymore, that expelled those sudden sobs when we arrived home to the news from New York Hospital. Richard Nixon, mon semblable, mon frère. Alas, he would never again have the chance to show him. A few days later, on April 27, the diary contains a description of the funeral. Quote, "Poor Reagan looked very out of it, staring at nothing with an open mouth, probably thinking he was on the set for Cattle Queen of Montana. And yet, when everyone stood for the Star-Spangled Banner, he managed to mouth all the words. The thing that touched me most, when they put on the porch light of that little frame house. Richard Nixon was home, R.I.P. My diary was trying to give him and our relationship a decent, hasty burial. In fact, we still had so much time yet to spend together. How many books of mine he turns up in. The White House tapes appear in my study of diaries, where they're discussed as the ultimate example of a secret journal whose discovery sets in motion someone's undoing. In a scene from Fellow Travelers, a novel, Nixon is there at Joe McCarthy's wedding, speaking the words he actually said to reporters coming out of the church on September 29, 1953. "The bride was lovely, but then I've never met a bride who wasn't." I could hardly improve upon this maladroit combination of attempted suaveness and unconscious offense. And so after quoting it exactly, I have one reporter murmur to another, "Did he just insult Joe's wife?" And there he is in Yours Ever, a much later companion to the diaries book, where I briefly ponder Nixon's wartime letters from the South Pacific to Pat. Quote, "You'll never know how proud I was to show your picture to all the fellas," he wrote her. "Everybody raved, wondered how I happened to rate. I do too." Did he ever? One cannot understand Nixon without factoring in that whatever may have passed between them down the years, he was, when they got together in the late 1930s, madly in love with Pat Ryan, a pretty high school teacher he met in an amateur theatrical group. She was dating someone else and told him she was not interested, but he persisted with the awkward doggedness that was his lifelong trademark. "This fellow you're dating," he asked Pat, "does he have a car?" "No, he doesn't," she responded. "How about if I drive you and him on your dates?" She was enough amused by this that she let him, and eventually the very weirdness of his devotion wore her down. I knew these things because as the long years of his exile went by, and even after his death, I never really stopped thinking and reading about him. I suppose I was sneaking up to the subject, circling it for 30 years. By 2003, my partner and I were living in Washington, across the street from the Watergate. That little red arrow points to our house, and my study was on the top floor. We were across the street from the Watergate, that complex of curved buildings Nixon claimed never to have passed, let alone entered. Few things are more elusive than the origins of a novel, but after several years of looking through my study window at the scene of the crime, I started work on the longest book of fiction I'd ever written, a narrative covering the whole claustrophobic little epic that was Watergate, from the break-in to the pardon. Starting in 2008, I spent most of 3 years with him, wallowing in Watergate, sometimes letting his voice be the last one I heard before going to sleep. Many of the White House tapes are up on YouTube, endlessly looping, being heard by somebody somewhere at every moment in time, as if they were Moon River or After You've Gone. They leave a listener enthralled and revolted, not just by the nastiness of Nixon's bigotry or what he himself called the gangster language of his Confederates, but also by the crude dullness of his musings on almost any subject but foreign policy. His talents in that realm had much to do with the tape's creation and preservation. So long as they remained playable, no one, he thought, would be able to argue that anyone but Nixon himself, not Henry Kissinger, had conceived his administration's grand designs. Indeed, to hear Nixon conducting foreign affairs on a visionary level during the worst and most preoccupying months of Watergate is to marvel at his capacities for concentration and perhaps dissociation. Listening to the tapes that pertain to Watergate itself, one realizes that far from trying to cover up what knowledge of the scandal he actually has, Nixon is usually trying to demonstrate more knowledge than he possesses, trying to convince his aides that he remembers who worked where and did what, trying to make the staffers with whom he's now conspiring believe that he's more on top of things than he is. But I found myself especially absorbed by the muted nature of his reaction to success, especially his massive win in November of 1972, 12 years after a hair's breadth loss and 4 years after a hair's breadth win. Finally, he had a majority to exceed even those won by Eisenhower, his exasperating patron. And yet the immediate experience of his own landslide victory left him subdued, even downcast. If you listen to the tapes of the congratulatory phone calls he took that night, he sounds curiously depressed, more defeated than triumphant. What I think he was realizing, in the recesses of a subconscious he probably didn't believe in, was that the only way he could ever again run for the presidency, and thereby feel fully himself, was to have lost the election. He had just won by a mile. He felt, I'm certain, not the joy of victory or any imminence of the disaster that would soon engulf him, but the first approach of death. Brown, of course, has its own connections to Watergate. In fact, the scandal has one of its most important roots in the university's alumni activities. It was at a Brown event in Washington, D.C., probably in 1966, that E. Howard Hunt, class of 1940, met the class of 1953's Charles Colson, the man who famously said that he, quote, would walk over his own grandmother if it would be helpful to the re-election of Richard Nixon. From this meeting flowed Hunt's recruitment to the Nixon White House and the formation of the leaks-plugging plumbers, a slightly crazy precursor to the even madder intelligence-gathering operation that included the Watergate burglary in June of '72. Hunt was an exceptionally complicated man, a serious writer, at least at first, a Guggenheim Fellow who had once published fiction in The New Yorker. His long career in the CIA, which included heavy involvement in a 1954 coup to overthrow the government of Guatemala, flamed out over his involvement in the failed Bay of Pigs operation in Cuba in 1961, some of whose participants would later, at Hunt's behest, break into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate. In between, Hunt turned to writing commercial spy novels as a way to keep making a living. I met him through the least Nixonian man I have ever known, the Brown professor whom I loved the most and who taught me the most, Elmer Blistein. That's me and Elmer, I think at Vassar, where I was teaching in the 1980s. Elmer Blistein, for whom a house on campus is now named, and who at this moment stands before my eyes as vibrantly as he sat behind a seminar table in Horace Mann House, when during my junior year I was lucky enough to take his year-long honors course in Shakespeare. Permit me what will be for just a minute or two, or will seem for just a minute or two, a sentimental digression. From the day I first entered Elmer's class until the last time I saw him, a few months before his death in 1993, he looked exactly the same. The smile on his face verging toward a laugh, the mum in his buttonhole, and what Shakespeare would have called his bald pate. That premature baldness may be the best guarantor of imperceptible aging is a truth no 19-year-old could have grasped. Just as Elmer assured us students back then, none of us would really appreciate the sexual power of Antony and Cleopatra until our bodies and hearts had a few more miles on them. It was a youth-worshiping age, and Elmer was the only adult I can remember who dared to treat our youth as something we would mercifully get over. He was a wonderful teacher and editor who ripped the literary scales from my eyes one day when he suggested I stop writing papers in this god-awful stilted academic style that I thought betokened seriousness and start writing them in the smart-ass voice I used during class discussions. Long years after I graduated, he was still editing me. During the first September of his retirement, he wrote to express approval of something I'd written for the New York Times book review before zeroing in inevitably on what he was sure was one small misinterpretation. Picky, 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 he conceded, but since this marks the first time in about 40 years that I haven't had the dry heaves during the first week of classes, I had to maintain my franchise. I don't think it was until that moment, reading that note, that I realized how none of it had ever come easy. The smooth, inevitable-sounding lectures, the ad-libs that students could go home and put in their diaries, the arresting little marginal corrections in one's essays. In fact, every bit of his unchanging routine had demanded as much effort and maintenance and faith as Theseus and Prospero expended on their domains. This man who so confidently taught the works of the world's greatest playwright suffered from, of all things, stage fright. I go on about Elmer because I suppose life won't give me many chances to think and talk about him, many more chances, but also because he is one part of the connected history of Brown and Watergate, which became plain to me in 1990 when I was back on campus to give a commencement forum on plagiarism, a subject on which I just published a book. Elmer introduced me to the audience in Lower Manning and then took a seat in the front row near a member of the class of 1940 who was back for his 50th reunion. The man looked familiar. Yes, it was E. Howard Hunt, a slightly older contemporary of Elmer, who was class of 42. The decades of friendship between these two classic East Side liberals, Elmer and his wife Sophie, and this notorious rogue CIA man, whose hard fall involved a prison sentence and a stroke, included Elmer's facilitating the John Hay Library's acquisition of Hunt's papers. As friends, Elmer and his wife Sophie were ever true. That's Howard Hunt. At the right, Sam Strite, Merrily Taylor librarians, and that's Elmer and Sophie. And this was at this little party after my commencement forum. After my talk, they hosted a cocktail party at their house on Alumni Avenue, during which Hunt even spoke a little bit about Watergate. He said he was repelled by a recent Nixon appearance on Larry King Live. He said RN had learned and was sorry for nothing. Sophie was surprised to hear Hunt's own implied penitence here. He'd never talked about Watergate in her presence before, and he remained unreconstructedly right-wing. Extending the Brown-Watergate connection into a new decade, I did some business with Howard Hunt the following year. I was working for Condé Nast as the literary editor of GQ, and we were thinking about running a piece on Norman Mailer's enormous new CIA novel, Harlot's Ghost, in which Howard Hunt is a character. I thought, why not have Howard Hunt write the piece? Which he did, and very well, I should add. He wrote for me once more about the exposure of Aldrich Ames's spying for the Soviets. And he also wrote me dozens of short, friendly letters, which he would compose in the morning while warming up at his typewriter, and which he insisted didn't require a response. A few days after Elmer died in September 1993, Sophie called to ask if I would please break the news to Howard so that he wouldn't find it out through some newspaper or alumni publication. I remember telephoning him from my office and learning that he'd in fact just heard it an hour or so before. We began to reminisce about Elmer, this vivid, humane friend who'd stood by him. But we didn't talk for long because this tough guy, undercover operative and convicted criminal, was too choked up to stay on the line. Howard himself died in 2007 before I'd given any real thought to writing my Watergate novel. Once I was embarked on it, I of course regretted not having talked to him at length about the whole calamity over the one meal I can recall our having, some years after I met him at Elmer's. I do remember asking him one question relative to Watergate, if he ever heard from Colson, class of 53, who by then had made his new life as an evangelical Christian. Yeah, said Howard. He sends me his books and inscribes them, yours in Christ. As he told me this, he mimed sticking his finger down his throat, the international sign for it's enough to make you puke. I suspect, despite what Sophie Blistein hoped she was hearing back in 1990, that Howard regretted only Watergate's ineptitude, not its perfidy. And even as he seemed to be wishing for Nixon to wear sackcloth and ashes when he was on Larry King, one must remember that the chief thing Howard Hunt had against Richard Nixon was the president's having been insufficiently responsive to Howard's attempts to blackmail him. As for Nixon himself, I think anyone would be hard put not to find at least an element of penitence in his last 2 decades, even if he was mostly concerned with rehabilitating his reputation rather than his soul. He wrote serious books, never took money for a speech, and quietly briefed his successors on his high-level foreign travels. Bill Clinton considered one Nixon memo about a trip to Russia to be so outstanding that he upbraided his paid advisors on the National Security Council for their inability to deliver anything as good. Late this April, the playwright Robert Patrick died. A few months after my class graduated, Patrick's drama, Kennedy's Children, had its first production. To some extent, our own childhoods did belong to Kennedy, but the decade of our adolescence and young adulthood, from 1963 to 1974, was presided over by two of the most serious, neurotic, devious, and gifted men ever to occupy the White House. It's surprising that we survived them. But no one would ever argue that Lyndon Johnson or Richard Nixon had no business being president. During the more recent 45th president's time in office, I was asked more than once by journalists to offer comparisons between Trump and Nixon. I remember waving off one of them by saying that I couldn't, because in terms of psychological complexity, it was like being asked to compare a paramecium to a dolphin. 50 years ago this May, while my class was graduating, the class of 1923 was holding its 50th reunion. Most of them had been born the year in which William McKinley, who'd fought in the Civil War, was assassinated. The boys in that class missed fighting in World War I by a matter of months. Nixon was a dozen years younger than they, only 8 when Woodrow Wilson left office. But for all that he would come to despise college presidents, Nixon held Wilson to be his favorite US president, perhaps because Nixon too wished to remap the world, to scramble and rearrange all of its existing alliances and enmities. He would sometimes, when we watched him on television during our years at Brown, mention that he was speaking to us from the Wilson desk in the Oval Office. The poor bastard didn't know that the desk had actually belonged to one of McKinley's vice presidents, Garrett Hobart, and had never been used by Woodrow Wilson, and no one on his staff had the heart to tell him. As with Lyndon Johnson, tragedy clings to Nixon, along with more than the usual number of if-onlys and what might have beens. Members of the class of '73, my class, are now at a time in life when our minds turn toward those aspects of existence, a last phase in which we wonder if our own might-have-beens are perhaps being enacted in some other, realer universe, of which this one is a mere simulation. At this long remove from the early 1970s, when my mind thinks of such things relative to Nixon, I tend to imagine and wonder about what it would have been like had Eisenhower, not Nixon, been the first president ever to resign. It nearly happened. This is from Eisenhower's second inauguration in 1957. It nearly happened. In November of 1957, Ike suffered a stroke that left him for a brief period incoherent and enraged with frustration. Resignation was secretly in the air at the White House and more openly in the press. The New York Post, still a liberal paper back then, which had been Nixon's scourge during the Checkers scandal, editorialized that Eisenhower should quit and make way for his vice president. In the days before Ike managed to recover, Nixon demonstrated competence and restraint, winning praise even from such enemies to his left as Walter Lippmann and James Reston. Had Eisenhower retired to Gettysburg, Nixon would have reached the presidency a dozen years sooner, at the age of 44. He would have arrived in the Oval Office, misshapen by politics, to be sure, a bruising campaigner who'd been forced to balance his checkbook on live TV during the Checkers scandal, and then to spend 5 years trying to figure out the ways of a maddening boss that everybody else seemed to love. But he would not have undergone the tremendous mental damage done to him by the two crushing defeats that at that point still lay ahead, his 1960 loss to Kennedy and the subsequent truly humiliating loss of the California governorship. Instead, he would suddenly have been presiding over a country not yet at war in Southeast Asia and not yet at war with itself. If that had happened, who knows what this gifted, knotted-up man, this one of us, might have spared himself and his wife and the then middle-aged members of the class of 1923, and every other one of us still here and alive this afternoon. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. have a special mic for questions. And we're going to take some questions now. There are microphones in the aisles. Anyone who has an opinion about, does anyone have an opinion about Richard Nixon or anything? Anybody? Yes.
What would he think about the political landscape, the polarization, and the nature of the Republican Party and the nature of the conservative movement in general? I know it's difficult to get into his head, but what would his thoughts be?
It's always hard to predict what the long dead, might be thinking. But hard as this is to believe, given one of the things we most associate with Nixon, which is this foul mouth on the tapes and this hair-trigger temper and all of these enmities, I think he'd be aghast. I really do. Can you imagine him saying about the Speaker of the House that she was the wicked witch who would soon be burning in hell? Can you imagine him insulting the special prosecutor? He fired him, but he wouldn't insult him. Nixon believed in all of his campaigns, you run to the right to get the nomination, and then you run back to the center. He wanted to be a great man, and he wanted to be a great man by doing great things. He was not somebody who entered the presidency already thinking he was a great man and thinking that the presidency was sort of like a lateral move from being a phony billionaire. I think he'd be quite aghast. I think his conservative credentials would still be intact, although domestically he was very liberal by Republican standards. And I think what he would have wanted above all was seriousness. With something like what's going on in the House right now, the inability to elect a speaker. This would have been a politics that was utterly foreign to him. It's become almost a cliche to say that, he looks better and better, for everything that happened. So that would be my guess, but it is just a guess. Thank you. Anybody?
Tom, that was
Hi.
masterful. Thank you.
Thank you.
I just wondered if you'd talk a bit about yourself in relationship to the politics that surround us and who you resonate with. You gave us a flavor for who you gravitated to 50 years ago. And have you been able to find compatriots in today's climate?
I'm going to make a shocking statement that I find the current political climate of the United States to be rather depressing. I was more conservative than my classmates when I arrived at Brown, and I was more conservative than most of them, and certainly more conservative than most of my writer friends for most of the decades of my adulthood. And I was always bifurcated. I was very shortly after I got out of Brown, I was an openly gay man, and I obviously was somebody who was not in sympathy with what became the social agenda of the Republican Party. But there were many things that appealed to me: a robust foreign policy, the freeing of Eastern Europe, the collapse of the Soviet Union, all of these things that happened under fairly normal Republican presidents with support from Democratic presidents. I worked in the government for a couple of years. I was the deputy chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities. I went to Afghanistan because of that, and I was very much in sympathy with the American effort in Afghanistan. I voted for Biden in 2016. I had certainly left the Republican Party. By then I was registered, but I always thought I was independent-minded, as it were. But I knew I would quickly be disappointed by President Biden, and Afghanistan arrived about 6 months into his term. I would like to see a vibrant center. I think that one of the things, and I don't mean to give such a long-winded answer to this, but one of the things I miss about my youth, where politics are concerned, is that in those days, both of the major parties had wings to them. There were liberal Republicans. I grew up in New York when Nelson Rockefeller was the governor. Jacob Javits was the senator. And there were very conservative Republicans, libertarian conservatives like Barry Goldwater, one of the most honest men in public life, I think, whatever you think of his politics. And the Democratic Party, ranged all the way from people way on the left, Bella Abzug in Congress when we were in college, to the right-wing segregationists who were still the core of the party. I don't want any, God knows, segregationists in Congress. But the fact that the parties did not have simple ideologies enabled people to make deals, enabled the government to run. And now we have these parties which are, the Democratic Party moves further left, the Republican Party moves off the freaking earth. And we have this ideological clash that's really designed for a parliamentary system, not for a presidential one. And we're in a lot of trouble. I'd be sympathetic to a third party, but I don't want a third party to bring about the return of somebody that it might lead to. I mean, you can never predict what third party results are really going to be, but that's, as I say, a very long-winded answer. Anybody else? Time for one or two more? Anyone? Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. But
Hi. I'm a parent of a current Brown student. I see that you've spent your life really being connected to Nixon, and he was, gave you perspective on your country and yourself. And now, like you, I'm disheartened with current politics. What kind of message would you have to students today from your kind of connection, heartbreak, reconnection, that would help them look at their future and how they would designate their time?
I'm sorry, Nixon's on my brain from having just read this. Never give up, never be petty. I mean, that is the strangest 3 words ever uttered by an American politician when Nixon said never be petty. But I would say never give up. I would not give up on the country. To paraphrase Barbara Jordan, she was saying it about the Constitution, but I think you could extend it to the country. And at some level, way deep down, I still believe this, when she said her faith in the Constitution was whole, it was total, it was complete. And I think at some level, I still believe that about the country. As bad as things are right now, but get involved at some level. I hate politics at the moment, and I loved politics. I mean, you saw me voting for Nixon at 9 years old, and a lot of my fiction has been political in nature. And at the moment, I can't bear it. I try to operate on a micro level. I've spent a lot of the last 2 years trying to extract a family of refugees from Afghanistan, get them settled in the States, and have been succeeding. 8 of them are here. They are safe. They are living here, and they were marked for death because of the bravery of the head of the family. And there was that old, I think it was sort of a liberal or left expression, think globally, act locally, or maybe I'm flipping it, act locally, think globally. And I can't think globally or even nationally at the moment, but I try to act in a microwave. I'm ready for that. I try to act in a micro way. That was what I was struggling to say. So I think one more and then we'll wrap it up. Anybody? Yes, in the back.
Well, it was a great talk. I think you briefly mentioned about Nixon with China about 50 years ago. So at that time, they break the ice, to house to country become friends. Now, 50 years later, since the relationship is not as good at that time or at the best time. So as a scholar, what's your reflection on all the change of the last 50 years?
Well, you're kind to call me a scholar. I mean, I started out as one, but I'm certainly not a scholar of history. I'm a fabricator of history. I mean, as a novelist, I sort of play games with history. It's very difficult to say. I remember, what Nixon said at the time of the China trip, or relatively close to it. He said, 50 years from now, they will be a great power, not because they're communists, because they're Chinese. He had tremendous respect for the Chinese and their culture. Again, just as I think he'd be unhappy about domestic politics, I think he'd be unhappy about the tensions between America and China. I think he would be very, very resolute when it came to the former Soviet Union and what's now Russia's movement into Ukraine. But it's an almost unimaginable length of time. I mean, when I found myself thinking about them, thinking about the class of 23, who seemed magically to have reappeared. I think I must have hit the button. I mean, just look at the pictures and just consider how we looked. Not that we were any prize, God knows, in 1973, but you realize how long 50 years is. And these people, they were 70, 71, whatever, while we were graduating. They were all over campus that weekend. It's, unimaginable. I mean, they had been through, by that time, 3 major wars in the space of a few decades. So I wish I had any answers. But actual geopolitics are really quite beyond me. I don't think he'd be happy about things with China. And if he were still merely in his 80s, he died in his early 80s, I think in some ways he'd be useful. If he were still around, he'd be useful in advising about China, maybe even dealing with China, because the Chinese had tremendous respect for him, for the gesture he made. And he went back many times. He felt more welcome there than he did in lots of places in the US throughout the 1970s and 80s. But I guess with hopes for better times, myths will wind things up. Okay? Thank you so much for coming.